Matt Walsh got me pregnant. Hey everyone, welcome back to Lives on Reddit. Don't forget to subscribe to be a for lifer. I was raised Mormon, and growing up, I always thought that I would have kids because that's just what people do. Then I got married and realized I wasn't thrilled about having kids, so I kept putting off that sacred duty. It didn't help that my husband was one of 10 children, and he came from a household of chaos and squalor. His squabbling siblings were the best birth control ever. I got on birth control pills almost as soon as I was intimately active. I kept noticing a trend of all my Facebook friends getting pregnant, having kids, and complaining about every unfortunate step of parenthood. I started researching topics like what I wish I knew before I had kids and what they don't tell you about childbirth. I learned about the cascade of interventions. I learned about the frequent lack of informed consent in obstetrics. I read about the infantilization of pregnant women. I read horror stories of women who felt traumatized after childbirth, manipulated, maimed. I learned about episiotomies, postpartum depression, and the husband stitch. I learned about there are women who don't have an automatic rush of hormones that make them bond with and love their newborns. I learned that the US has the highest maternal mortality rate of a study of 11 developed countries. I read stories from countless regretful parents, mostly women, who shouldered the lion's share of the burden of parenthood, resenting their husbands and feeling trapped and wanting to escape the earth. I had an epiphany after a couple of years of marriage that I could choose to just not have kids, even though I knew such a decision would make me a pariah in the church. Plus, I rationalized we couldn't afford it yet anyway. Because I was raised Mormon, my political views were staunchly conservative. I voted for John McCain in 2008 and fellow Mormon Mitt Romney in 2012. I agreed with just about everything Matt Walsh and PragerU posted on Facebook. Then one day I read something Matt Walsh posted about how hormonal birth control increases your chance of getting brain cancer. I learned that birth control can increase your risk of stroke, especially if you're prone to migraines, which I have occasionally. I started feeling uneasy about it. I started to look into other forms of birth control like the rhythm method. I like the idea of not pumping my body with synthetic hormones. I've been on them for about 4 years. I stopped taking the pills, my libido increased, I liked it. I'd missed my old libido, so did my husband. We used latex during the weeks. I calculated that I might be ovulating. After about 6 months of this, I missed my period. I got several Dollar Tree pregnancy tests. The first one was negative, but my period still didn't start. So 2 days later, I took another test. Faint positive. Panic. 2 days later, another test. Strong positive. Despair. Because I was still a good Mormon, I initially thought that abortion wasn't an option. I got a pregnancy book from the library. It wasn't what to expect when you're expecting because I had read unfavorable things about it. I learned that early pregnancies, which are free of morning sickness, were more likely to result in miscarriage. I felt a faint surge of hope because I hadn't had any morning sickness. One afternoon, I read that there was a slight correlation between caffeine consumption and miscarriage. I self-consciously drank some Dr. Pepper. I wasn't sleeping well. I would lay awake, racked with anxiety for hours. My first thought, every morning when I woke up, was remembering that I was pregnant, and then immediately regretting that I was conscious. One evening, I had a headache, probably from the lack of sleep. I took an Advil without thinking, then realized I hadn't considered what it might do to a developing fetus. I felt guilty. I bought some Tylenol. I started keeping a journal of what I ate, avoiding sweets and restricting food. I exercised hard, given frantic energy by the same anxiety that kept me awake. I started researching the evil A word, feeling ashamed, conflicted, but desperate. I prayed hopelessly for a miscarriage. Surely God would punish me with a pregnancy to force me to grow up because there's spirit children in heaven waiting their turn to come to earth. Before I was even born, I promised God to assist them because trials and tribulations are the only way to grow, right? The refiner's fire. Please let this cup pass. There's a scene in The Return of the King where the elf maiden Arwen is traveling through the forest on horseback to the docks. Their ships are waiting to take them to the undying lands where she would live forever with her fellow immortal elves. But she has a vision of a little child running into the arms of his father, who she recognizes as Argon, her lover. She chooses to forsake immortality and stay in Middle-earth to see the future of her vision unfold. I prayed for a vision like Arwen's, just a snapshot of the future for reassurance, asking God to convince me that I would love this child. The heavens were silent. I blamed myself for my lack of faith. I confessed my stress to my bishop, the leader of the congregation. He advised me to research the joys of motherhood. I messaged 5 of my trusted college friends for their thoughts on the subject. Their replies were frank but supportive. After about 5 weeks of this tumultuous mental tornado, one evening I discovered blood spotting my underwear. I felt a surge of hope. Was this it? My deliverance? Later that evening, I started feeling crampy and took some pain reliever. At around 4:30 a.m., I woke with cramps, which intensified over the course of about 2 hours. I sat on the toilet, passing blood and diarrhea. The worst menstrual cramps I've ever had. At the peak of the pain, I was nauseated and dizzy. Shortly after the crescendo, I passed a peach pit-sized lump of tissue. I pulled it out of the toilet and ripped it open, expecting to see some kind of little paradise. There was nothing. By 7 a.m., I was feeling well enough to go to work. By 7:30 a.m., I was feeling elated. I skipped around the house while getting ready. A week later, I took another pregnancy test and was rewarded with a negative. I got back on birth control. I became pro-choice. I explored feminist topics on Pinterest. About a year later, I did too much research on the history of polygamy in the Mormon Church and discovered that the religion that shaped my life was founded on hiding inconvenient truths along with a healthy dose of outright lies, retconning, fraud, and intimacy trafficking. I formally left the church in 2019. I became an atheist. I voted for Joe Biden in 2020. Life is wild, y'all. Thanks, Matt Walsh. I left the church as a teenager, but I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I stayed, particularly with regard to children, and if I would have felt forced to have them. I'm so glad I felt able to make the decision to be child-free. What prompted you to leave? Well, I felt uneasy about the church starting at about age 7 or 8, and I think it started because I felt the church was extremely sexist. I had a lesson about polygamy and how my husband would be having other wives in the afterlife. Then there were the constant lessons of the role of women, and I never really saw myself as a brood mare. Beyond that, religion never quite added up to me. Since then, I've learned all about the other insurmountable Mormon problems. Oh, and also I found out my brother was gay as a teenager and thought that the life of a gay person in the church was nothing to be admired. Unfortunately, he still believes. Yay! I myself am ex-Latter-day Saints. My parents were livid. My dad grounded me and my mom threw plants at me. I was 18 at the time when I told them I don't believe in the church. I married outside the church to an amazing man and couldn't be happier. Except for still living in Utah. My mom still has the hope of me returning to the church, but once the light gets turned on in her brain about the truth of the church, there is no going back. Once I get done taking care of her, I'm ditching Utah and removing my name permanently. Wish you the best in your adventure. Thanks, you're right, there's no going back. It would be like trying to force myself to believe in a literal Santa Claus. Of all the repercussions I've heard from people coming out to their family as ex-Mormon, playing projectiles is a new one. I was a part of Jehovah's Witness as a child. I was always filled with dread that I might end up with the men from that church and being pregnant and miserable like all the other women. Surprisingly, my mom isn't the one who pushed me towards them. I got mostly bingoed and shamed by people in the church. One day I left, chose to be child-free, and I always say, I was in a cult once that protects people who intimately assault children. Now I'm out. Great to see you happy and thriving. Jehovah's Witnesses are a strange bunch for sure. My first real exposure to them was a YouTuber talking about the Caleb and Sophia show that the Watchtower Society puts out. They're people you want to stay away from for sure. Oh, for sure. The sad thing is when you're out, but your family is still in. It's like you can see the crazy that spews out of their mouths. They have a glossed over dead look inside of them. I too escaped the Mormon church and recently got a vasectomy at 26. Terrified of what my still practicing father would have to say, his response was actually just, "Good for you, don't let anybody tell you how to live your life." Which I thought was very ironic considering he let some 70-year-old con artist in Salt Lake tell him how to live his life, but much better than I expected. Good for you for getting out and not ending up with the burden that gave you so much anxiety to think about. Congrats. Whoa, 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 whoa. Don't leave. Subscribe. Be a for lifer. Ooh.